billionaire who wore rags to dinner. A story that will change how you see people forever. The moment Cornelius Pemberton walked into Le Bernardin wearing a frayed jacket and scuffed shoes, his in-laws' faces twisted with disgust. But what happened next shattered everything they thought they knew about wealth, power, and respect. If you've ever been underestimated or judged by your appearance, you need to read this story to the end. Like, share, and follow for more incredible justice stories that prove character always trumps cash. The chandeliers of Manhattan's most exclusive restaurant cast prismatic rainbows across white tablecloths as Cornelius Pemberton pushed through the heavy brass doors, the autumn chill still clinging to his worn denim jacket. The maitre d's eyes flickered with barely concealed disapproval, scanning the frayed collar, the jacket with its missing button, the shoes whose leather had cracked into a roadmap of hard miles, before his professional mask slid back into place. Cornelius had specifically chosen this outfit, each threadbare piece carefully selected from a donation bin at a Brooklyn shelter, because tonight wasn't about comfort or appearance. Tonight was about truth and truth. He'd learned over 43 years of living, rarely dressed in Armani. The reservation was under Bernadette Pemberton's maiden name, Fitzwilliam, old Connecticut money that opened doors with the effortless ease of inherited privilege. And as Cornelius followed the maitre d' through the sea of designer suits and shimmering gowns, he could feel the eyes tracking him like a stain spreading across expensive fabric, whispers following in his wake like the trailing notes of a discordant symphony that didn't belong in this temple of culinary excellence where meals cost more than some families earned in a month. His wife Bernadette waited at a corner table, her face a carefully composed mask of neutral elegance, but Cornelius caught the flicker of concern in her honey-colored eyes, the slight tension in her jaw that told him she was already regretting this experiment, this test that she'd reluctantly agreed to after years of her family's subtle condescension had finally worn through her patience like water through stone. Beside her sat the Fitzwilliam family tribunal. Archibald Fitzwilliam, Bernadette's father, whose silver hair and tailored Tom Ford suit spoke of generations of wealth that had never known the indignity of a denied credit card or a bounced check. His Patek Philippe watch catching the light as he raised a crystal glass of 18-year-old Macallan to his thin lips. Gertrude Fitzwilliam, Bernadette's mother, draped in Chanel and judgment, her lips pursed as if the very sight of Cornelius had introduced a sour note to her carefully curated evening, her diamond necklace refracting light like tiny accusations. And Percival Fitzwilliam, Bernadette's younger brother, a hedge fund manager who wore his Princeton education and his Brioni suit with equal arrogance, already smirking before Cornelius had even reached the table, his eyes taking inventory of every worn seam and dated style choice with the precision of a pawnbroker assessing worthless collateral. Cornelius, Archibald said, the name emerging like something distasteful that needed to be expelled quickly, his handshake perfunctory and cold, lasting barely a second before he withdrew his hand and subtly wiped it against his napkin. A gesture so swift and practiced that most people would have missed it, but Cornelius had built a tech empire worth $8 billion by noticing details that others overlooked, by reading the micro-expressions and body language that revealed truth beneath polite lies. Gertrude offered her cheek for an air kiss that stopped 3 inches from actual contact, her Chanel No. 5 creating a barrier of expensive fragrance between them, while Percival didn't even bother standing, just nodded with that trademark smirk that Cornelius had endured for the 3 years since he'd married Bernadette. A smirk that said volumes about what Percival thought of his sister's choice in husbands, about men who came from nothing and would return to nothing despite their best efforts. To climb ladders they weren't meant to ascend. The restaurant hummed with the quiet conversations of the wealthy, that particular frequency of hushed voices discussing mergers and acquisitions, summer homes in the Hamptons, children at Exeter and Choate. The gentle clink of silverware against bone china creating a rhythm like a heartbeat, while the kitchen beyond the swinging doors orchestrated a ballet of Michelin-starred precision, the scent of seared duck and truffle oil and butter-poached lobster wafting through the dining room like olfactory poetry written in ingredients most people only read about in magazines. Cornelius settled into his chair, feeling the worn cotton of his jacket pull across his shoulders, the fabric thin enough that he could feel the expensive upholstery beneath, and he watched the Fitzwilliam family watch him, their eyes cataloging his appearance with the thoroughness of anthropologists discovering a primitive specimen in their midst, their expressions ranging from Gertrude's barely concealed horror to Percival's open amusement to Archibald's cold calculation. As if he were already computing the cost of this embarrassment to the family name, measuring the social capital hemorrhaging from his daughter's catastrophic choice in spouse. "So Cornelius," Percival began, his voice carrying that particular tone of false friendliness that preceded an attack, the verbal equivalent of a cobra's hood spreading before the strike. "Still working in that tech thing? What was it? Some kind of app?" He emphasized the last word as if it were a child's lemonade stand, something cute and ultimately meaningless in the grand architecture of serious business. The kind conducted in mahogany boardrooms and exclusive golf clubs where membership-weighted lists stretched longer than presidential terms. And Cornelius noticed how Percival's eyes lingered on the cracked screen of his Samsung phone, a budget model from 3 years ago that he'd purchased specifically for tonight, loaded only with family photos and a few apps, nothing that would betray the 5 phones he actually used to run his empire, to communicate with presidents and prime ministers, to execute deals that moved markets and changed industries. "Something like that," Cornelius replied quietly, his voice carrying none of the defensive edge that Percival was fishing for, just a calm acceptance that made Gertrude's nose wrinkle as if his very passivity confirmed everything she'd always suspected about his lack of ambition. His fundamental unsuitability for a woman of Bernadette's breeding and expectations. The sommelier appeared with a wine list that read like a rare book auction catalog, pages of vintages that cost more per bottle than most people's monthly rent, and Archibald immediately ordered a 2010 Chateau Margaux without consulting Cornelius. A power play disguised as generosity, the kind of casual expenditure meant to establish hierarchy, to remind everyone at the table who held the purse strings, who belonged in restaurants where the wait staff knew your preferences before you spoke them. And your reservation was honored not because of a credit card but because of a name that appeared in society pages and charity galas and the occasional scandal that money could smooth over like expensive ointment on a wound. "Bernadette tells us you've been quite busy lately," Gertrude said, her tone suggesting that busy meant unemployed or unemployable, her eyes drifting to his jacket with its missing button, and Cornelius caught Bernadette's hand clenching beneath the table, her knuckles white against the white tablecloth, her breathing shallow as she prepared for whatever humiliation her mother was about to unveil like a magician pulling a rabbit from a hat, except this rabbit would have teeth and claws and a taste for blood. "I do hope you're not working too hard at that little company of yours. What was it called again? Something with computers." She said computers the way someone might say intestinal parasites, as if the entire technology industry were beneath serious consideration, a passing fad that would eventually give way to the real economy of inherited wealth and strategic marriages and investments managed by serious men in serious firms who understood that money should grow quietly and predictably like ivy on brick, not explode in volatile surges that upended entire industries overnight. "I managed to keep busy," Cornelius said, accepting a menu from a waiter whose eyes held sympathy, the kind of recognition that service industry professionals develop for people being mistreated. A silent solidarity that Cornelius appreciated even as he noted the menu's complete lack of prices. That particular affectation of restaurants so expensive that if you needed to ask, you couldn't afford to eat there, each dish described in loving detail that transformed ingredients into poetry. Line, caught Dover sole with champagne beurre blanc and microgreens grown in rooftop gardens. Dry-aged Wagyu beef from cattle raised on beer and massages and classical music. Vegetables that had provenance stories longer than most people's resumes. Every plate a work of art that would be photographed and Instagram filtered and hashtagged before the first bite, though Cornelius noticed how Archibald ordered for the entire table without asking preferences. Another power play in a dinner that had become a chess match where Cornelius had deliberately positioned himself as a pawn to reveal the true nature of the opposing players. Percival leaned back in his chair, swirling his pre-dinner cocktail with the confidence of someone who'd never been told no, who'd never faced a door that didn't open at the sound of his family name, and Cornelius recognized the type because he'd negotiated with dozens of Percivals over the years, trust fund managers and legacy admits who confused inheritance with achievement, who measured their worth in possessions rather than accomplishments, and who would never understand that real power rarely needed to announce itself, that actual wealth whispered while poverty screamed and the truly rich moved through the world without price tags or designer logos because they had nothing left to prove to anyone. "You know, Cornelius, I was just closing a deal last week, $200 million fund allocation, and I thought about you," Percival said, his voice carrying across the table like a stone meant to wound. "I thought, here I am moving markets, and somewhere out there Bernadette's husband is probably fixing someone's Wi-Fi or whatever it is you do. Must be quite different from what we're used to in this family. The words hung in the air like gun smoke, and Cornelius saw Bernadette's jaw clench, saw her about to speak, to defend, to reveal what Percival's arrogance had blinded him to. But Cornelius squeezed her hand gently. A silent message to let this play out, to let the Fitzwilliam family show their true colors and shades of contempt and condescension that no amount of expensive education or cultured accents could disguise, because this dinner wasn't about defending himself, it was about Bernadette. Finally seeing, truly seeing, what Cornelius had endured in silence for 3 years, every holiday gathering where he'd been introduced as Bernadette's husband without profession or identity, every family photo where he'd been positioned at the edge like an afterthought, every conversation that had flowed around him like water around a stone, as if his presence were merely tolerated rather than welcomed, accepted rather than celebrated. Hashtag family drama, hashtag hidden wealth, hashtag respect matters. Must be quite an adjustment for Bernadette, Gertrude added, her voice dripping with synthetic sympathy that barely concealed the judgment beneath. Going from our lifestyle to, well, she gestured vaguely at Cornelius as if he were an incomplete sentence, a thought that didn't bear finishing. Whatever this is, I do hope you're at least able to keep her comfortable, Cornelius. She's accustomed to certain standards, you understand. The right schools, the right neighborhoods, the right people. The implication was nuclear in its clarity. You are not the right people, you will never be the right people, and we tolerate you only because our daughter inexplicably insists on this catastrophic match that has brought our family lineage down into the mud of your mediocrity. And Cornelius felt Bernadette trembling beside him, whether with rage or humiliation or both. He couldn't tell, but he held her hand tighter, a silent anchor in the storm of her family's cruelty disguised as concern. The appetizers arrived in a choreographed presentation that belonged in an art gallery. Microgreens arranged with tweezers, sauces painted in geometric patterns that would make Kandinsky weep. Each played a testament to the chef's vision and the restaurant's commitment to charging obscene amounts for portions that required a magnifying glass to appreciate. And Archibald held court about market fluctuations and portfolio diversification with the assumption that everyone at the table understood and cared about the intricacies of municipal bonds and dividend yields, occasionally glancing at Cornelius with an expression that suggested he was simplifying his language for the benefit of the financially illiterate, speaking slowly and clearly as one might to a child or a foreigner, and Cornelius played his part beautifully, nodding politely, asking occasional simple questions that confirmed every assumption the Fitzwilliams held about his limited understanding of how real money worked, about his fundamental position outside the circles of true power and influence. Those shoes, Gertrude suddenly said, her voice cutting through Archibald's monologue about emerging markets like a knife through silk, and every head turned to look at Cornelius's feet, at the worn brown leather that had cracked along the creases, at the sole that had separated slightly from the upper, at the laces that were clearly replacements from a different pair, and Cornelius felt the temperature at the table drop several degrees as Gertrude's disgust radiated outward like cold from dry ice. Cornelius, darling, didn't Bernadette offer to take you shopping? I know she has excellent taste, and there are several stores where the Fitzwilliam name carries quite a bit of weight. We could certainly help you present yourself more, shall we say, appropriately? The condescension was so thick Cornelius could taste it, metallic and bitter like old pennies, and he noticed the other diners glancing over, their curiosity piqued by the Fitzwilliam family's increasingly loud dissection of their daughter's husband's inadequacies. This public execution disguised as a family dinner, this humiliation served alongside $18 oysters and $30 cocktails in a restaurant where discretion was supposedly guaranteed but gossip. But gossip was the real currency that fueled Manhattan's social economy. Percival laughed, a sharp barking sound that carried too far in the hushed restaurant, drawing more looks, more attention, and Cornelius understood that this was the point, that the Fitzwilliam family wanted an audience for this particular performance, wanted witnesses to their daughter's poor judgment, wanted the story to spread through their social circles like a cautionary tale about what happened when good families allowed their daughters to marry beneath their station, when breeding mixed with whatever Cornelius represented in their carefully constructed worldview where everyone had their place and crossing boundaries led to exactly this kind of dinner, this kind of embarrassment, this kind of living proof that some gaps were too wide to bridge with love or determination or anything else besides the money and status and pedigree that Cornelius clearly lacked. Dad, you should see his phone, Percival Stage whispered, loud enough for the neighboring tables to hear. Screen so cracked it looks like a spider web. I wanted to offer him my old one, the iPhone I replaced last month, but I didn't want to embarrass him. Though I suppose this whole evening is pretty embarrassing already. Isn't it? Bernadette's hand gripped Cornelius's so hard he felt his bones shift, and when he looked at her he saw tears threatening at the corners of her eyes, saw 3 years of accumulated pain surfacing in a single moment, because this wasn't just about tonight. This was every Christmas when her family had given Cornelius gift cards instead of actual gifts, as if choosing something personal for him was too much effort for someone who didn't really count. This was every Fitzwilliam family gathering, where conversations stopped when Cornelius entered rooms, where his opinions were solicited and then ignored, where his accomplishments were diminished and his failures were catalogued with the precision of accountants balancing books that would never come out in his favor. This was the wedding where Gertrude had cried not from joy but from grief, mourning the match Bernadette could have made, the senator's son or the CEO's nephew or the European noble, whose title would have looked so elegant on wedding invitations and provided such excellent dinner party conversation for the next 40 years. #emotional story #they judged him #character over money. I think perhaps we should discuss something else, Cornelius said quietly, his voice carrying a note of gentle authority that made Archibald's eyes narrow, some instinct recognizing that the tone didn't quite match the costume, didn't quite align with the image of a struggling tech worker barely keeping his head above water in an expensive city that chewed up and spat out people without the right connections or the right family names or the right combination of luck and privilege that separated the penthouse dwellers from the subway riders. And for just a moment uncertainty flickered across Archibald's face before his natural arrogance reasserted itself. Because surely this man in his thrift store jacket and cracked phone couldn't represent any actual threat to the Fitzwilliam family's established hierarchy, couldn't possibly possess any cards left to play in a game where they'd already decided he'd lost before sitting down. The main courses arrived in another orchestrated presentation, servers moving in synchronized precision like a ballet company, each plate covered with a gleaming silver cloche that was lifted simultaneously to reveal the treasures beneath. And the aromas that rose from those plates were intoxicating, complex layers of flavor that represented hours of preparation and decades of culinary tradition. But Cornelius barely tasted his perfectly cooked Dover sole because he was too busy watching the Fitzwilliam family watch him, cataloging every movement, every bite, every sip of the wine that Archibald had ordered, searching for some breach of etiquette that would confirm their suspicions about his background, his breeding, his fundamental unfitness for their daughter, and he gave them nothing, eating with perfect European style, knife and fork never clashing, wine glass held by the stem, bread broken never cut, every movement demonstrating an education they hadn't expected and couldn't reconcile with the image they'd constructed of him as some kind of ambitious nobody who charmed their daughter with false promises and cheap sentiment. So Cornelius, Archibald said, pushing his plate aside with barely half the expensive fish consumed, a gesture of waste that only the truly wealthy could afford to make without guilt. Let's speak plainly man to man. What exactly are your intentions regarding Bernadette's future? I hope you understand that she comes from a family with certain expectations, certain standards that we've worked very hard to maintain over generations. My great-grandfather built the Fitzwilliam fortune from railroad investments, my grandfather expanded it through shipping, my father moved into finance, and I've continued that tradition. We're talking about over a century of careful stewardship, of maintaining not just wealth but reputation, position, influence. And now Bernadette has chosen you, and I must confess I'm struggling to understand what exactly you bring to this equation beyond. Well, he gestured at Cornelius with his wine glass, the burgundy liquid catching the light like blood. Whatever this is supposed to be, the moment stretched like taffy, pulled thin and tense, and Cornelius felt Bernadette about to explode beside him, felt her gathering breath for a defense that would shatter whatever remained of her relationship with her family. And he squeezed her hand again, held her back, because this was his moment. This was what they'd agreed to. This humiliation, revelation, reckoning, transformation, legacy arc that would either heal the family wound or cauterize it permanently. And Cornelius had learned long ago that timing was everything, that revealing your hand too early was amateur hour, that real power came from patience, from letting your opponents overcommit to their positions before showing them exactly how badly they'd miscalculated, how thoroughly they'd misread the situation, how completely they'd underestimated the man in the worn jacket who'd sat through their mockery with the patience of someone who had nothing to prove because the proof was already written in bank accounts and stock portfolios and real estate holdings that spanned 6 continents and employed 14,000 people and generated revenue that dwarfed the Fitzwilliam family's century-old fortune like an ocean dwarfed a swimming pool. "I think," Cornelius said slowly, carefully, his voice quiet but carrying a new quality that made even Percival stop smirking, "that I should probably be going." He stood, smoothly, gracefully, and reached into his worn jacket pocket, pulling out a wallet that had seen better days, its leather cracked and faded, and Gertrude actually gasped, her hand flying to her diamond necklace as if Cornelius were about to pull out food stamps or worse, ask Archibald to cover his portion of the meal, confirm every terrible suspicion they'd harbored about this marriage being nothing more than a gold-digging operation dressed up in romance and chemistry and whatever. Else Bernadette had convinced herself justified throwing away her future on a man who couldn't even afford a decent jacket. But Cornelius just smiled. That same quiet smile that had faced down hostile boardrooms and skeptical investors and competitors who'd underestimated him right up until the moment his companies had crushed theirs. And he pulled out a credit card, black and heavy, American Express Centurion, the card that had no spending limit and no preset credit limit and came by invitation only to people whose annual spending exceeded certain 7-figure thresholds. And he placed it on the table with a soft click that sounded like a judge's gavel. "I'll take care of dinner," Cornelius said, his voice still quiet but now carrying something else. Something that made the Fitzwilliam family stare at the card as if it were a hallucination, because they knew what that card meant, knew that it wasn't something you applied for or requested, knew that American Express sent it to people whose financial profiles triggered certain algorithms and whose spending patterns and income and assets reached levels that excluded 99.9% of the population, and Archibald actually picked it up, turned it over, checked the name embossed on the front, Cornelius Thaddeus Pemberton, as if it might be stolen or borrowed or somehow faked despite the distinctive weight and feel of the titanium and the way the restaurant's manager was suddenly hovering nearby, recognition dawning on his face because people who carried those cards got remembered, got special treatment, got everything that money could buy and several things it couldn't. "What?" Gertrude started, but her voice died as Cornelius turned toward the restaurant's entrance. And that's when they saw them, the 3 black Cadillac Escalades idling at the curb. Their windows tinted so dark they looked like holes in reality, and the men in sharp black suits standing beside them, the kind of men who wore earpieces and moved with the controlled precision of serious security professionals, not mall cops or rent-a-guards but former Secret Service and Navy SEALs and Mossad. Agents who'd been hired by someone who needed protection not because they were paranoid but because their net worth made them a walking target for kidnapping and extortion and every other creative crime that desperate people invented when they encountered the kind of wealth that could ransom small countries and still have enough left over to buy a private island as a tax write-off. #Billionaire reveal, #Karma story, #viral story. The manager appeared at Cornelius's elbow, his face transformed from professional courtesy to genuine reverence, the kind of expression that medieval peasants probably wore when meeting royalty, and he bowed slightly, actually bowed. Something Cornelius had never seen him do for any other customer, including the celebrities and politicians and genuine aristocrats who frequented Le Bernardin, and he said, "Mr. Pemberton, it's an absolute honor to have you dining with us this evening. I hope everything was to your satisfaction. Please let me know if there's anything at all we can do to make your experience more memorable." His voice carried across the suddenly silent restaurant because every other diner had stopped eating, stopped talking, stopped pretending not to notice the drama unfolding at the Fitzwilliam table, and phones were emerging from designer handbags and Armani pockets. Cameras pointed at Cornelius and the SUVs and the security detail that looked like something from a presidential motorcade. Percival's face had gone the color of spoiled milk, his earlier smirk replaced by an expression of dawning horror as his wine-soaked brain finally connected the dots that sober intelligence would have spotted hours ago, and he stammered, "Wait, you're not. You can't be. That Cornelius Pemberton? The Cornelius Pemberton." And Cornelius just smiled, sad and gentle and without any trace of triumph because this wasn't about winning. Wasn't about crushing his in-laws even though they'd certainly crushed him repeatedly over 3 years of accumulated insults and dismissals and casual cruelties that death by 1,000 cuts. And he said simply, "I'm just Cornelius Pemberton, Bernadette's husband, the same person I was when I walked in here tonight wearing these same shoes and this same jacket, the same person I've Always been, though I understand now that you never actually bothered to learn who that person was. Too busy judging the costume to notice the man wearing it. Archibald had gone completely still, his face cycling through expressions like a slot machine. Shock, disbelief, horror, calculation, fear. Before landing on something that might have been respect or might have been the awareness that he just committed the social equivalent of insulting a reigning monarch while standing in their throne room. And he opened his mouth twice before managing to rasp out, "Cornelius, we didn't, how were we supposed to?" But the words died because there was no ending to that sentence that didn't condemn him. No way to finish the thought that wouldn't confirm everything Cornelius had just said about judgment and assumptions and the Fitzwilliam family's complete failure to see beyond surfaces, beyond bank balances, beyond the markers of status they'd used their entire lives to separate the worthy from the worthless, never imagining that wealth could hide in plain sight, that power could wear thrift store clothes, that a man who could buy and sell their precious Fitzwilliam fortune 10 times over might choose to dress like someone they wouldn't hire to clean their pool houses. Gertrude's hand shook as she reached for her wine glass, her diamond necklace suddenly looking cheap and gaudy compared to the quiet authority radiating from Cornelius now that he'd dropped the pretense. Now that the mask had slipped and they could see what had been there all along if they'd bothered to look past their prejudices and preconceptions, and she whispered, "The Pemberton Technologies Cornelius Pemberton? The Cornelius Pemberton who just took 3 companies public last year? The Cornelius Pemberton who donated $200 million to cancer research and got that award from the president? That Cornelius Pemberton." Each question was a hammer blow, each recognition another nail in the coffin of her comfortable worldview where she and Archibald and Percival were the wealthy ones, the powerful ones, the people who mattered, never imagining that they'd spent 3 years patronizing a man whose morning stock market gains probably exceeded their annual income, whose casual philanthropic donations dwarfed their carefully publicized charity work, whose influence extended into boardrooms and government offices and international consortiums that operated on scales the Fitzwilliam family couldn't even conceptualize. The restaurant had become a theater, every diner now openly watching the drama unfold, phones recording for social media because this was the kind of moment that went viral, that launched 1,000 memes and think pieces and late-night television monologues. This real-life fairy tale where the prince had disguised himself as a pauper and the supposed nobility had revealed themselves as petty, small-minded, cruel, and Cornelius saw Bernadette crying openly now. 3 years of pain and humiliation and watching the man she loved be diminished by the family she'd been raised to respect. And he pulled her close, kissed her forehead gently, whispered something that made her laugh through tears, and he turned back to face the Fitzwilliam family. These people who'd never once asked about his childhood in a Guangzhou slum, where dinner was whatever his mother could afford after 60-hour workweeks in factories that paid pennies, who'd never asked how he'd learned English from library books and how he taught himself to code on computers at the public library, and how he'd worked 3 jobs while getting his degree, and how he'd built his first company with $5,000 borrowed from friends who'd believed in him when no one else would, when no Fitzwilliam would have given him the time of day, much less investment capital or mentorship or any of the 1,000 advantages that Percival had been born with and squandered on mediocrity dressed up as excellence through the magic of family connections and legacy admissions. "I need to go," Cornelius said, his voice carrying clearly in the silent restaurant, "because I have a board meeting in Tokyo tomorrow morning, and the jet needs to leave JFK in about 90 minutes, and unlike some people, I actually work for my money rather than just inheriting it and watching it grow through the labor of people smarter than myself." The words landed like artillery shells, each one finding its target with devastating precision, and Percival actually flinched. His earlier arrogance completely evaporated, replaced by the dawning awareness that he just mocked someone who could buy his hedge fund as a toy for a nephew. Someone whose companies had changed entire industries while Percival had been managing other people's money with varying degrees of competence. And Cornelius saw the exact moment when Percival's brain started calculating how badly he'd just sabotaged his own career, because in the world of high finance, insulting Cornelius Pemberton was like insulting Warren Buffett or Ray Dalio or any of the other titans whose opinions could make or break careers, whose word carried more weight than all the Fitzwilliam family connections combined. Archibald stood slowly, his carefully constructed dignity crumbling like a sandcastle facing a tsunami, and he extended his hand, then withdrew it, then extended it again, his face working through expressions like an actor trying out different roles before settling on something that might have been contrition or might have been damage control, and he said, "Cornelius, please, I apologize, we had no idea. If we'd known, But Cornelius cut him off with a gentle shake of his head because that was exactly the point, exactly the lesson that the Fitzwilliam family needed to learn if they were capable of learning anything beyond the social calculus of who mattered and who didn't based on external markers of status and wealth. And Cornelius said, "That's the problem, Archibald. You had no idea, and you never bothered to find out. You spent 3 years measuring me by my shoes and my phone and my jacket, never once asking about my character or my values or what I might contribute beyond a bank balance. You taught Percival that net worth equals self-worth, taught Gertrude that appearance equals reality, taught Bernadette that her family's love was conditional on choosing a husband who met your arbitrary standards of acceptability, and you did all of this while congratulating yourselves on your sophistication and your culture and your generations of breeding that apparently taught you everything except basic human decency and respect." The security detail had moved closer, professionals doing their job, protecting their principal from what they'd identified as a potentially hostile situation, and the lead agent caught Cornelius's eye, received a subtle head shake that meant stand down. Not yet, let this play out. And Cornelius appreciated the man's discipline, his ability to assess and respond without overreacting, unlike the Fitzwilliam family who'd overreacted to everything about Cornelius from the moment they'd met him, judging him by every superficial measure except the ones that actually mattered. And now they stood there in this expensive restaurant with its Michelin stars and its celebrity chef and its clientele who'd probably be gossiping about this dinner for the next 6 months. And they looked small and diminished and defeated in a way that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with the sudden awareness of their own moral poverty, their own spiritual bankruptcy, their own complete failure. To recognize that wealth meant nothing without wisdom, that status meant nothing without substance, that all their generations of careful breeding had produced was entitled children who measured worth in dollars and judged character by the cost of shoes. Gertrude was crying now, mascara running in dark rivers down her carefully made-up face, and she reached for Bernadette, tried to embrace her daughter who'd stood and moved closer to Cornelius, and Gertrude said, "Bernadette, sweetheart, please understand, we were just concerned. We only wanted what was best for you, we didn't know." But Bernadette pulled away, her face hard with a resolve that Cornelius recognized from their courtship when she'd chosen him over her family's objections. When she'd walked away from her trust fund and her inheritance and everything the Fitzwilliam name represented because she'd understood something her family never would, that love and respect and genuine partnership mattered more than all the social advantages and financial security and country club memberships that came with marrying the right kind of person from the right kind of family with the right kind of pedigree that supposedly separated the wheat from the chaff, the worthy from the worthless, the people who mattered from the people who were merely tolerated as unfortunate necessities in their daughter's misguided romantic adventure. #family drama, #respect matters, #justice story. "You didn't know because you never asked," Bernadette said, her voice shaking but firm, 3 years of accumulated frustration finally finding its voice. "You never wanted to know because knowing would have complicated your narrative about Mom's poor daughter who married beneath herself and needed to be rescued from her own terrible judgment. You invited us to dinners and made Cornelius feel like a charity case. You gave him gift cards while everyone else got thoughtful presents. You introduced him as Bernadette's husband like he didn't have his own identity or accomplishments. You asked him to wait in the car during family photos because he didn't fit the aesthetic you wanted to present on your Christmas cards. And through all of it, he was patient and kind and understanding because he loved me enough to endure your contempt. And I was too much of a coward to stand up to you until tonight." Her words fell like stones into still water, ripples of recognition spreading across the Fitzwilliam faces as they confronted, perhaps for the first time, the cumulative weight of their 3-year campaign to make Cornelius feel unwelcome, unworthy, unwanted in their family circle. And Cornelius saw Archibald's face finally crack, saw real emotion break through the armor of entitlement and social superiority, saw something that might have been shame or might have been the first stirrings of actual self-awareness. The manager approached again, hesitant now, carrying a leather folder that contained not a bill but rather a handwritten note on the Bernardine letterhead. And he presented it to Cornelius with another slight bow, and Cornelius read it quickly then smiled, because the owner had written a personal note apologizing for not recognizing him earlier, offering the meal as a gift along with a private dining room for his next visit and a case of vintage wine that probably cost more than most cars. And Cornelius showed it to Bernadette, who laughed, a sound like breaking glass, sharp and cleansing. And then Cornelius did something that perfectly encapsulated the difference between him and the Fitzwilliam family. He took the Centurion card that Archibald had placed back on the table, added it to his wallet, pulled out $500 bills. Instead, and left them on the table with a note that said, "For the staff, thank you for your excellent service tonight." Because while the Fitzwilliam family would have accepted the free meal as their due, as natural recognition of their importance, Cornelius understood that the servers and busboys and kitchen staff had worked hard tonight and deserved to be recognized regardless of whether the owner was comping the meal, and this simple gesture said more about his character than all the Fitzwilliam wealth could purchase. The 3 black SUVs waited like patient beasts, engines purring, security details scanning the street with professional paranoia that came from knowing that their principal's net worth made him a target for everything from paparazzi to kidnappers to industrial espionage from competitors who'd pay millions for information about his next move, his next acquisition, his next innovation that would reshape some industry and make fortunes for early investors while destroying the businesses of people who'd been too slow or too arrogant to adapt. And Cornelius guided Bernadette toward the lead vehicle, his hand on the small of her back, protective and gentle, and he paused before the open door to look back one last time at the Fitzwilliam family standing frozen at their table, at Archibald with his careful hair and his expensive suit and his century of family wealth that suddenly seemed like monopoly money compared to the empire Cornelius had built from nothing, at Gertrude with her diamonds, and her judgment and her complete inability to recognize that she'd spent 3 years insulting someone who donated more to charity in a single year than the Fitzwilliam family had donated in a century. At Percival with his hedge fund pretensions and his Princeton degree and his fundamental mediocrity that no amount of family connections could disguise, and Cornelius felt not triumph but sadness, profound sadness for these people who'd confused wealth with wisdom, status with substance, pedigree with character, and who'd raised a daughter brilliant enough to see through their shallow values, but damaged enough that she'd needed her husband to endure 3 years of humiliation before finding the courage to stand up to them. "I want you to understand something," Cornelius called back across the restaurant, his voice carrying clearly in the continued silence because every other diner was still watching, still recording, still witnessing this moment that would become a viral sensation by morning, that would launch 1,000 think pieces about wealth and class and the way society judges worth. "I didn't come here tonight to humiliate you, though I understand that's what happened. I came here because Bernadette asked me to, because she needed to see with her own eyes how you'd treat someone you thought was poor, someone you thought didn't matter, someone who didn't meet your standards of acceptability. And you showed her, showed all of us, exactly who you are when you think there are no consequences, when you think you're punching down at someone who can't punch back. The sad thing is that you're not bad people, you're just people who've never learned that a person's worth has nothing to do with their bank balance, that character can't be bought or inherited or faked, that respect is something you give not because someone has earned it through wealth or status but because they're human beings deserving of basic dignity and kindness." He paused, let the words sink in, saw them land like punches on Fitzwilliam faces that had never been forced to confront their own prejudices, their own casual cruelties, their own failure to live up to the values they claimed to hold, and he continued, "I built my companies on a simple principle. Respect everyone, underestimate no one, and judge people by their actions rather than their appearances. This served me well in business, made me a lot of money, sure, but more importantly it's made me the kind of person who can sleep at night without wondering if I've crushed someone's spirit just because I had the power to do it. You have all that Fitzwilliam wealth, all those generations of careful stewardship, all those connections and advantages and opportunities that most people never get, and what have you done with it except build walls to keep out people you've decided aren't worthy of your attention? What have you created except more inequality, more division, more reasons for people to hate each other based on arbitrary classifications that mean nothing in the end?" Archibald stepped forward, his hand raised as if to speak, but Cornelius wasn't finished, wasn't done teaching this lesson that the Fitzwilliam family desperately needed to learn if they were capable of learning anything beyond the social calculus that had governed their lives for so long, and he said, "I grew up in poverty that you can't imagine, Archibald. Not romantic poverty, not the kind that looks good in memoirs or inspirational speeches, but real grinding poverty where dinner was sometimes nothing and heat was a luxury and my mother worked herself into an early grave so I could have opportunities she never had. I learned English from library books because we couldn't afford language classes, learned to code on public computers because we couldn't afford one at home, worked 3 jobs while getting my degree because student loans didn't cover living expenses, and I built my first company with borrowed money and determination and a belief that maybe, just maybe, the world was big enough for a kid from a Guangzhou slum to make something of himself despite everyone telling him he wasn't good enough. wasn't smart enough, wasn't connected enough to succeed. Hashtag hidden wealth, hashtag emotional story, hashtag character over money. The words hung in the air like a bell that couldn't be unrung, and Cornelius saw Bernadette crying again. But these were different tears, proud tears, loving tears, the tears of someone watching her husband finally speak his truth after years of polite silence, years of swallowing insults, years of being the bigger person while smaller people tried to make him feel small. And he pulled her close again, kissed the top of her head, and turned back to face his in-laws one last time. I don't tell people that story because I don't need sympathy or admiration. Don't need anyone to be impressed by how far I've come or how much I've achieved. I tell you this now because you need to understand that the man you've been mocking, the man whose shoes you've been insulting, the man you thought wasn't good enough for your daughter, has already overcome obstacles you'll never face, has already achieved things you'll never accomplish, has already proven his worth in ways that have nothing to do with inheritance or family connections or any of the advantages you were born with and take for granted. And here's what really matters, Cornelius continued, his voice softer now but somehow more powerful, more commanding, carrying across the restaurant like a prophet speaking truth to power. I could have told you all this 3 years ago, could have pulled up in those SUVs on our first meeting, could have worn my wealth like armor, could have made sure you knew exactly who you were dealing with before you decided to judge me. But I didn't because I wanted to know if Bernadette's family were the kind of people who would respect someone they thought was ordinary, someone they thought was just a regular guy trying to make his way in the world. I wanted to know if your values extended beyond your tax bracket, if your culture included kindness for people you didn't think could benefit you, if your generations of breeding had taught you anything except how to look down on people you considered beneath your notice. Percival had collapsed into his chair, his face buried in his hands, and Cornelius felt a flash of genuine pity because Percival had never been taught anything else, had been raised in this ecosystem of entitlement and judgment where worth was measured in portfolios and pedigrees, where success meant graduating from the right schools and working at the right firms and marrying the right kind of person from the right kind of family. And now his worldview was shattering like glass. Every assumption he'd built his identity on revealed as hollow and false and ultimately meaningless, and Cornelius wondered if Percival had the strength to rebuild himself on better foundations or if he'd just retreat further into his privilege, using his family's money as a shield against the uncomfortable truths that this dinner had exposed like a surgeon cutting away diseased tissue to reveal the healthy flesh beneath. Gertrude approached Bernadette, her movements tentative, her face ravaged by running makeup and something deeper, some recognition of how badly she'd failed not just Cornelius but her own daughter, who'd been forced to choose between her family and her husband and who'd chosen correctly despite the cost, despite losing her trust fund and her inheritance and her place in the Fitzwilliam social circle. And Gertrude whispered, "Bernadette, please, I'm so sorry, I never meant, we never wanted." But the words died because what could she say? What apology could cover 3 years of systematic cruelty? 3 years of making her daughter's husband feel unwelcome in his own marriage. 3 years of undermining and dismissing and degrading someone who'd shown them nothing but patience and kindness and respect they'd never earned and certainly never reciprocated. "I know you didn't mean to be cruel," Bernadette said, her voice thick with tears but steady with resolve. "You just didn't think of him as real, as someone whose feelings mattered, as someone who deserved the same courtesy you'd show to any stranger on the street. You thought he was beneath us and so you treated him that way, and you never once stopped to consider that maybe, just maybe, your measuring stick was broken, that maybe wealth and status and family name weren't the only ways to judge a person's worth." She turned to Cornelius, took his hand and said loud enough for everyone to hear, "This is the man I chose, the man I love, the man who's shown more character in 3 years of enduring your contempt than you've shown in your entire lives of inherited privilege. And if you can't accept him, can't respect him, can't treat him with the basic dignity that every human being deserves, then you're not just losing him, you're losing me too." The moment crystallized into something that would be remembered, discussed, analyzed in business schools and ethics classes and dinner party conversations. This perfect illustration of how wealth and class intersected with character and values, how appearance and reality diverged, how assumptions and judgments created chasms that money couldn't bridge and status couldn't cross, and Cornelius felt the weight of it, felt the responsibility of this moment not just for himself and Bernadette but for everyone who'd ever been underestimated, dismissed, judged by their clothes or their accent or their background, everyone who'd been made to feel small by people who thought size was measured in bank balances rather than heart and spirit and determination. And he knew that what he said next would matter, would be quoted and misquoted and analyzed and debated, would become part of his story and his legacy and the mythology that always accumulated around people who built empires from nothing. "I forgive you," Cornelius said simply, the words hitting like a thunderclap in the silent restaurant. "Not because you deserve forgiveness, not because what you did was okay or acceptable or anything less than cruel, but because carrying anger and resentment would hurt me more than it would ever hurt you, and I didn't climb out of poverty and build everything I've built just to become bitter and vengeful when people reveal their own limitations." He paused, looked each Fitzwilliam family member in the eye, saw Archibald's shame and Gertrude's devastation and Percival's complete collapse, and he continued, "But forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting, doesn't mean pretending this didn't happen, doesn't mean going back to the way things were where you got to insult me at every family gathering while I smiled and took it because I loved your daughter more than I valued my own dignity. Things are different now. You've seen who I really am, and I've seen who you really are, and we can't unsee any of it." The lead security agent touched his earpiece, receiving some message that Cornelius couldn't hear, and he stepped forward to murmur, "Sir, we need to leave for the airport." But Cornelius held up a hand, one more moment, one more truth that needed to be spoken, and he turned back to the Fitzwilliam family who stood like statues, frozen in their humiliation and shock and dawning awareness that they just destroyed their relationship with their daughter over pride and prejudice and the kind of snobbery that seemed ridiculous when exposed to the harsh light of reality. And he said, "I want you to know that Bernadette and I are going to be fine, better than fine, because our relationship is built on love and respect and partnership, all the things your relationship with her wasn't. We're going to raise our children to judge people by their character instead of their bank balance, to treat service workers with the same respect as CEOs, to understand that wealth is a tool for doing good rather than a weapon for feeling superior. We're going to build the kind of family that you could have been if you'd ever stopped focusing on status and started focusing on substance." He helped Bernadette into the SUV, her hand trembling in his. 3 years of pain and frustration and loyalty finally validated, finally acknowledged, finally rewarded with this moment of clarity where her family's mask had slipped and revealed the pettiness beneath the polish. And as Cornelius slid in beside her, as the door closed on the restaurant scene that would dominate social media for weeks, as the convoy pulled away from the curb with the smooth efficiency of a presidential motorcade, he looked back one last time at Lou Bernardine's golden windows, at the Fitzwilliam family standing motionless inside, and he felt not triumph but release, the release of someone who'd been carrying a burden they hadn't realized was crushable until they finally set it down. #viral story, #karma story, #billionaire reveal. Inside the SUV's leather cocoon, surrounded by the soft beeping of security systems and the quiet professionalism of his protection detail, Cornelius pulled Bernadette close and felt her finally let go, felt 3 years of tension release in shuddering sobs that soaked his shirt, and he held her while the city lights streaked past, held her while she cried for the family she'd lost and the husband she'd almost lost defending, held her while she released all the accumulated pain of watching the man she loved be systematically diminished by the people who should have welcomed him, celebrated him, recognized that Bernadette had chosen wisely and well, had found someone who would value her for herself rather than her family name, someone who would build a life with her based on genuine partnership rather than strategic alliance, someone who understood that love meant showing up even when it hurt, even when pride demanded you walk away, even when endurance felt like weakness but was actually the strongest choice you could make. "I'm so sorry," Bernadette whispered against his chest. "I should have stood up for you years ago, should have made them see, should have forced them to respect you, but I was weak. I was scared of losing them, scared of being cut off from the only family I'd ever known, and I let you suffer because I was too much of a coward to choose." And Cornelius tilted her face up, looked into her red-rimmed eyes and said, "You chose every single day for 3 years by staying with me, by building our life together, by refusing to let their contempt poison what we had. Tonight wasn't about standing up for me. It was about you finally seeing clearly what I've known all along, that your family's love was conditional and their respect was transactional and their values were hollow, and you needed to see that for yourself or you'd always wonder if maybe I was the problem. Maybe I wasn't trying hard enough. Maybe if I just dressed better or talked smarter or done something different they would have accepted me." The SUV's phone chimed, a secure line from his office, and Cornelius's assistant said, "Sir, the board is confirmed for the Tokyo meeting. The jet's ready at JFK, and we've already filed the flight plan. Also, you're trending on Twitter, There are about 50 videos from the restaurant going viral right now, and the PR team wants to know if you want to make a statement. Cornelius glanced at Bernadette, who'd stopped crying and was listening, and he made a decision that perfectly captured who he was, who he'd always been beneath the costumes and the pretenses and the various masks that circumstances required, and he said, "No statement. What happened tonight speaks for itself. Tell the PR team to focus on our actual news, the Shanghai factory opening and the education initiative, and let the social media noise be social media noise. I'm not interested in being famous for putting my in-laws in their place. I'm interested in building things that matter, creating jobs, solving problems, making the world incrementally better than I found it." Bernadette smiled through her tears, that smile that had first captivated him 4 years ago in a coffee shop where they'd both reached for the same book, where they'd started talking about sustainable technology and ended up closing the place down, where he'd been wearing his actual clothes, expensive but understated, and she'd been dressed down from her usual style, and they'd connected on ideas and values and vision before money ever entered the equation, before she'd learned he was wealthy, and before he'd learned she was a Fitzwilliam, back when they were just Cornelius and Bernadette, two people who'd found something rare and precious and worth fighting for in a world that tried to commodify everything, including love itself. "That's why I married you," she said. "Not because of your money or your success or any of the things my family thinks matter, but because you're genuinely good, genuinely kind, genuinely committed to using your advantages to help people rather than to feel superior to them." The convoy merged onto the expressway toward JFK, city lights giving way to industrial zones and airport approaches, and Cornelius's mind was already shifting to the Tokyo meeting, to the factory opening that would employ 5,000 people in Shanghai, to the education initiative that would bring coding classes to underprivileged schools across Southeast Asia, to the next deal and the next challenge and the 1,000 details that required his attention. But part of him remained in that restaurant, in that moment of revelation, in that perfect illustration of why respect mattered more than reverence, why dignity trumped dollars, why character was the only currency that couldn't be inherited or stolen or devalued by market fluctuations. And he thought about all the people watching those viral videos, all the people who'd been underestimated and dismissed and judged by their appearance, and he hoped they'd take from tonight not just schadenfreude at the Fitzwilliam families, humiliation, but rather the deeper lesson that your worth wasn't determined by other people's opinions, that respect had to start with self-respect, that you didn't need validation from people who'd already decided you didn't matter. As the private jet lifted off from JFK, its Rolls-Royce engines pushing them into darkness and toward Tokyo and the next chapter of Cornelius's relentless empire building, Bernadette fell asleep against his shoulder, exhausted by the emotional storm of the evening, and Cornelius looked out at the lights of New York receding below, at the city where he'd first arrived 20 years ago with $500 and a dream and a stubborn refusal to accept that poverty was destiny, that birth determined worth, that the circumstances you started with define the possibilities you ended with. And he thought about that kid from Guangzhou who'd learned English from library books, who'd coded his first program on a public computer, who'd worked 3 jobs while getting his degree, who'd been told 1,000 times that he didn't belong, didn't fit, didn't have the right background or connections or credentials to succeed in America's ruthlessly competitive technology sector. And he thought about how that kid would feel watching tonight's video, watching the Fitzwilliam family's expressions shift from contempt to shock to shame, watching the moment when assumptions shattered and reality asserted itself like a verdict that couldn't be appealed. The Tokyo meeting went perfectly, 12 board members voting unanimously to approve the Shanghai expansion, to invest another $2 billion in manufacturing capacity that would employ thousands and produce the next generation of sustainable energy technology that Cornelius's companies had pioneered. And Cornelius gave his presentation with the same calm competence that had characterized his entire career, never mentioning the previous evening's drama, never letting personal matters intrude on professional responsibilities, because that was part of his discipline, part of what had made him successful when so many others had failed, this ability to compartmentalize, to focus on what mattered in each moment, to give every meeting and every decision and every interaction the attention it deserved regardless of what else was happening in his life. And when the meeting concluded and the board members filed out, the company's Japanese chairman approached Cornelius and said something that seemed unrelated to business but wasn't, not really, because everything connected to everything else in ways that weren't always obvious but were always present. "I saw the video from your dinner," the chairman said, his English carrying the precise formality of someone who'd learned it as a second language and perfected it through decades of international business. And I thought about my own father, who told me when I was young that in Japan we have a saying, "The nail that sticks up gets hammered down," which is about conformity and fitting in. But he also told me another saying that contradicts the first. The tiger who hides his stripes is still a tiger, which is about essence versus appearance, about how real power doesn't need to announce itself, about how the truly strong can afford to appear weak because they have nothing to prove to anyone. He paused, and Cornelius understood that this was as close as the formal Japanese business culture would come to direct praise, and the chairman continued, "What you did last night showed both wisdom and restraint, showed understanding of when to reveal and when to conceal, showed the kind of character that cannot be taught in business schools or inherited from wealthy families, and I wanted you to know that the board's vote today was not just about the Shanghai factory, it was about trusting you not just with our investment but with our reputation, because we believe you will use both wisely." Cornelius returned to New York 3 days later to find that the viral video had spawned a cultural moment, a conversation about class and wealth and how society judges worth, with think pieces in major publications and debates on talk shows, and even a Saturday Night Live sketch that somehow managed to be both funny and poignant, capturing the absurdity of the Fitzwilliam family's assumptions and the dignity of Cornelius's response. And his PR team reported that his company's stock prices had actually increased, that consumer sentiment had shifted even more positive, that the drama had somehow translated into business advantage even though Cornelius had specifically told them not to exploit it, had refused interviews and declined requests for follow-up statements because he'd said what needed to be said in that restaurant and had no interest in becoming a symbol or a spokesperson or anything else besides what he'd always been, which was a person trying to build useful things and treat people decently and maybe leave the world slightly better than he'd found it. Bernadette had been different since that dinner, lighter somehow, as if a weight she'd carried for years had finally been lifted, and she'd started therapy to work through the complicated feelings about her family, about the conditional love she'd been raised with, about the values she'd inherited and the values she'd chosen and the difficult process of untangling the two, and Cornelius supported her through it because he understood that his revelation hadn't just humiliated the Fitzwilliam family, it had also freed Bernadette from the obligation to keep seeking their approval, to keep hoping they'd change, to keep believing that somehow if she just tried hard enough or waited long enough they'd see what she saw in Cornelius and accept him fully rather than tolerating him as an unfortunate but unavoidable consequence of their daughter's stubbornness. Archibald Fitzwilliam had called twice, leaving voicemails that Cornelius hadn't listened to yet, couldn't quite bring himself to engage with because he'd said everything that needed saying and didn't have energy for apologies that would probably be more about salvaging the Fitzwilliam reputation than about genuine remorse. Didn't want to hear explanations about misunderstandings or justifications about protective parenting or any of the other rationalizations that people invented when confronted with their own failures, and Bernadette had asked him not to delete the messages. Had said she wanted to listen eventually but wasn't ready yet. Wasn't prepared to hear her father try to explain away 3 years of systematic cruelty with words that would probably make it worse. Would probably reveal that even now, even after everything, Archibald Fitzwilliam still didn't quite understand what he'd done wrong because his entire worldview was built on assumptions that the evening at Le Bernardin had challenged but perhaps not destroyed, because changing fundamental beliefs was harder than changing clothes, required more than a single evening's humiliation to accomplish genuine transformation. 6 months later, Bernadette was pregnant with their first child, and they'd moved into a new house in Westchester. Not a mansion despite what Cornelius could afford, but a comfortable home with good schools nearby and a yard where kids could play and neighbors who were doctors and teachers and small business owners rather than billionaires. Because Cornelius had learned young that happiness didn't scale with square footage, that the best parts of life, love, laughter, purpose, connection, couldn't be purchased no matter how many zeros appeared on your bank statements, and he wanted his children to grow up understanding that wealth was a tool for doing good rather than a measure of human worth, that respect was earned through character rather than inherited through bank accounts, that the most important things you could possess were intangible. Integrity, kindness, courage, humility, the ability to recognize that everyone you met knew something you didn't, had struggled with, something you hadn't, deserved consideration and respect regardless of how they dressed or where they worked or what their bank balance reported. The Fitzwilliam family had been invited to a gender reveal party. Bernadette's olive branch, her attempt to rebuild something from the ruins of that dinner, and Cornelius had agreed because he genuinely wanted his child to have grandparents even if those grandparents were flawed and limited and carried baggage that would probably never be fully unpacked. and when Archibald and Gertrude and Percival arrived at the Westchester house, they came differently than they'd been before. Quieter somehow, less certain, with none of the casual arrogance that had characterized their previous interactions with Cornelius, and Archibald especially seemed diminished, aged by 6 months in ways that suggested the viral video's aftermath had been harder on him than Cornelius had intended or anticipated, because public humiliation on that scale wasn't something the Fitzwilliam family was equipped to handle, wasn't part of their experience with a world that had mostly bent to accommodate their expectations rather than challenging their assumptions. "Cornelius," Archibald said, extending his hand with none of the reluctance that had characterized their previous interactions. "Thank you for inviting us. I know we don't deserve another chance after how we behaved, but I wanted you to know that I've spent the last 6 months thinking about that dinner, about everything you said, about everything I didn't say when I should have." His voice carried genuine emotion, raw and unfiltered in ways that Cornelius had never heard from him before, and Cornelius shook his hand, felt the tremor in Archibald's grip that spoke of age and illness, and perhaps the beginning of understanding that wealth couldn't protect you from life's fundamental challenges, couldn't prevent time from passing or bodies from failing or mistakes from haunting you in the quiet hours when sleep wouldn't come and regrets accumulated like compound interest. They gathered in the backyard where Cornelius and Bernadette had set up a celebration that was modest by Fitzwilliam standards but perfect by human standards, with friends from Cornelius's companies and Bernadette's book club and neighbors who'd been kind when they'd moved in. And when the moment came and the balloon popped and pink confetti rained down revealing a daughter on the way, Cornelius saw Gertrude crying again. But these were different tears than the restaurant tears, were tears of joy mixed with regret, tears for the granddaughter she'd almost missed knowing because of pride and prejudice and values that had seemed so important until they'd been exposed as hollow, and she approached Cornelius afterward and said simply, "I hope you'll let me try to be a better grandmother than I was a mother-in-law. Let me try to teach her some of the things I should have learned earlier, like how to measure people by their character instead of their credentials, how to respect effort, instead of just admiring results, how to see past surfaces to the substance beneath." Percival had been quieter than Cornelius had ever seen him, had spent most of the party talking to some of Cornelius's employees, asking genuine questions about their work and their lives with none of his previous condescension, and later Cornelius learned that Percival had quit his hedge fund job and started a nonprofit focused on financial literacy for underprivileged communities, that he'd donated a significant portion of his trust fund to the cause, that he'd apparently taken the Lou Bernardine humiliation as a catalyst for genuine change rather than just temporary embarrassment, and Cornelius felt something shift in his estimation of his brother-in-law, felt a door open that had been closed, felt the possibility that people could actually learn and grow and become better versions of themselves if the lesson was painful enough and the motivation was genuine and the support structure existed to help them through the difficult process of examining and discarding beliefs that no longer served them. As the sun set over Westchester and guests lingered over dessert and coffee, Cornelius stood apart for a moment, watching Bernadette laugh with her mother, watching Archibald carefully hold a neighbor's infant as if practicing for his granddaughter's arrival, watching Percival engaged in animated conversation with Cornelius's head of security about nonprofit strategy and community outreach, and he thought about journeys and transformations, about how that dinner at Le Bernardine had been a kind of crucible that had tested everyone involved and revealed their essential natures, their capacity for growth or their commitment to staying stuck in patterns that no longer worked, and he realized that the story wasn't really about him at all, wasn't about a billionaire putting arrogant in-laws in their place, wasn't about justice or karma or any of the viral hashtags that had turned his private moment into public spectacle, but rather about the universal human challenge of seeing past surfaces, of recognizing that worth couldn't be measured in dollars or determined by appearances, of understanding that respect and dignity were rights rather than privileges, were things you gave freely rather than parceled out based on calculations about who deserved them and who didn't. His daughter, they'd already chosen the name Eulalia, after Cornelius's mother who died too young from working too hard in factory conditions that would be illegal if anyone had cared enough to enforce the laws, would grow up with advantages that Cornelius never had, would attend the best schools and have every opportunity that money could provide. But Cornelius was determined that she'd also learn the lessons that poverty had taught him, would understand that wealth was temporary but character was permanent, that possessions came and went but integrity lasted, that the most important inheritance he could give her wasn't money in a trust fund but rather values in her character, principles that would guide her when he was gone, when she faced her own crucibles and challenges and moments of choice between taking the easy path that privilege offered and taking the harder path that character demanded. "What are you thinking about?" Bernadette asked, appearing beside him with that intuition that couples developed after years of learning each other's rhythms and patterns, and Cornelius pulled her close, felt their daughter, Eulalia, his mother's legacy, his gift to a future that would hopefully be kinder and wiser than the past. Moving between them, and he said, "I'm thinking about respect and how it's the only currency that really matters, how you can have all the money in the world and still be poor if you haven't learned to treat people with dignity, how you can come from nothing and still be rich if you understand that everyone you meet is carrying burdens you can't see and fighting battles you don't know about and deserving of compassion and consideration regardless of how they're dressed or where they came from or what their bank statements report." He thought about that kid from Guangzhou, about the library books and the public computers and the 3 jobs and the $500 that had seemed like all the money in the world when he'd first arrived in America with dreams too big for his circumstances. And he thought about how that kid would react to knowing that someday he'd have billions, would employ thousands, would donate hundreds of millions to causes he believed in, would stand in his own backyard in Westchester celebrating. His daughter's impending arrival surrounded by friends and family, including the in-laws who'd once mocked his shoes and his phone and his jacket. And he realized that success wasn't really about the money or the companies or the influence or any of the external markers that society used to measure achievement, but rather about staying true to the values that kid had learned when he had nothing, about remembering that respect was something you gave rather than something you demanded, about understanding that character was built in the hard moments when no one was watching and your choices revealed who you really were beneath the costumes and the roles and the various masks that circumstances required you to wear. As darkness fell and solar-powered lanterns illuminated the backyard with soft golden light, Cornelius gathered everyone together for a toast, raised his glass of sparkling cider. He'd stopped drinking alcohol years ago, another habit from poverty that he'd never felt the need to change, and said, "I want to thank everyone for coming tonight to celebrate Eulalia's impending arrival, to share in our joy, to be part of this moment that matters more than any business deal or market success or viral video could ever matter. And I want to say something that I hope Eulalia will understand when she's old enough to read the transcript of tonight that Bernadette's already recording for her baby book." He paused, looked around at the faces illuminated by lantern light, saw Archibald and Gertrude holding hands with an intimacy that suggested they'd spent the last 6 months rebuilding not just their relationship with Cornelius but their relationship with each other, saw Percival looking more peaceful than Cornelius had ever seen him, saw Bernadette glowing with pregnancy and happiness and the satisfaction of seeing her family finally starting to understand what she'd understood all along. And he continued, "The most important thing I can teach my daughter isn't about money or success or achievement, though those things have their place. The most important thing is about respect, how you give it freely to everyone you meet regardless of their circumstances, how you measure people by their character instead of their credentials, how you understand that everyone's fighting battles you can't see and carrying burdens you don't know about and deserving of dignity and compassion and the benefit of the doubt." He looked directly at Archibald and Gertrude and Percival, held their eyes with his own and said, "Eulalia will grow up with advantages I never had, will never know what it's like to be hungry or cold or worried about next month's rent. And that's a blessing that I worked hard to provide for her. But it's also a challenge because privilege can blind you to other people's struggles, can make you think that your circumstances are the result of your superiority rather than your luck, can turn you into someone who judges others by their shoes instead of their soul." The words landed softly but firmly, a reminder without being a recrimination, an acknowledgement of the past without dwelling on it. And he saw understanding in the Fitzwilliam faces, saw recognition that this wasn't just a toast but a teaching moment, a lesson about legacies and what we passed on to the next generation and how the choices we made today shaped the people our children would become tomorrow. "So tonight," Cornelius concluded, "I want to toast to something more important than wealth or status or family name or any of the things that seem so important until you realize they're not. I want to toast to character, to integrity, to the courage to admit when you're wrong and the humility to learn from people you previously dismissed, to the recognition that respect is something we all deserve simply because we're human, not something we have to earn through achievement or inheritance or any other arbitrary standard." He raised his glass higher and everyone else followed suit, and in that moment Cornelius felt something shift, felt the possibility of real healing, real transformation, Real legacy that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with the values you lived by and the example you set and the way you treated people when you thought no one important was watching. And he realized that the dinner at Le Bernardin hadn't been an ending but rather a beginning, the start of a different kind of story where people actually learned from their mistakes instead of just repeating them, where wealth became a tool for doing good instead of a weapon for feeling superior, where family meant supporting each other through growth and change rather than demanding conformity to outdated values that no longer served anyone. Years later, when Eulalia was old enough to understand, Bernadette would show her the viral video from that restaurant, would let her watch her grandparents' faces shift from contempt to shock to shame, would explain how sometimes people need to be humbled before they can learn to be humble, would teach her the difference between the power that comes from dominating others and the power that comes from lifting them up, and Eulalia would understand not just intellectually but deeply, fundamentally, in the way that really matters, that her father's greatest achievement wasn't building an $8 billion empire or employing thousands or donating hundreds of millions to worthy causes, but rather maintaining his humanity through it all, never forgetting where he came from, never losing sight of the fact that wealth and poverty were both temporary conditions but character was eternal, never letting success turn him into the kind of person who judged others by their appearances instead of their essence, who respected positions instead of people, who confused bank balances with human worth. And on the nights when Cornelius lay awake thinking about his mother who'd worked herself to death in those Guangzhou factories, who'd sacrificed everything so he could have opportunities she'd never dreamed of, who'd never lived to see him succeed or meet his wife or know her granddaughter, who carried her name forward into a future she'd made possible through her suffering and her love and her stubborn refusal to let circumstances crush her son's dreams. Cornelius would remember that restaurant dinner and feel grateful not for the viral fame or the business benefits or the satisfaction of proving his in-laws wrong, but rather for the chance to demonstrate to Bernadette and to himself and eventually to Eulalia that you could have all the money in the world and still choose humility, could possess all the power that wealth provided and still choose kindness, could win every battle and still choose grace over gloating, forgiveness over revenge, understanding over contempt. Because in the end, the only legacy that really mattered was the example you set for the people who'd remember you after the bank accounts were closed and the companies were sold, and all that remained was the impact you'd had on human hearts and human lives and the slow incremental process of making the world slightly better than you'd found it. One respectful interaction at a time, one moment of choosing dignity over dominance, one decision to see people as they truly were rather than as their circumstances suggested they must be. The greatest revenge Cornelius had learned that night at Le Bernardin wasn't humiliating the people who'd humiliated you. It was proving through your actions that their judgment said more about them than it ever said about you, was living so well and so completely according to your values that their opinions became irrelevant, was building something meaningful enough that their contempt couldn't diminish it, was loving someone fully enough that their rejection couldn't break it, was ultimately understanding that respect was never something you could demand from others but always something you could give to yourself. And once you truly believed in your own worth, once you measured yourself by your own standards instead of theirs, once you recognized that their validation wasn't necessary for your success or your happiness or your fundamental value as a human being, then you were finally, completely, irreversibly free from the power they'd only ever had because you'd given it to them, and you could walk away from any restaurant, any family gathering, any situation where you weren't valued, knowing that the problem was never you, was never your shoes or your jacket or your phone, but rather their inability to see past surfaces to the substance beneath, their failure to recognize that true wealth had nothing to do with money and everything to do with character, and that a person's worth could never be measured in dollars but only in the way they treated others, especially those they thought couldn't benefit them, especially those they considered beneath their notice, especially those who dared to show up in worn jackets and cracked phones and still demand the respect that every human being deserved simply because they were human, because they were trying, because they were doing their best in a world that often rewarded the wrong things and punished the right ones, and because ultimately character mattered more than cash, dignity mattered more than dollars, and respect, real respect, freely given to everyone regardless of circumstance, was the only currency that would endure when everything else had faded into dust and memory and the forgotten footnotes of history that no one bothered to read anymore. #JusticeStory, #RespectMatters, #character over money, #legacy of dignity.